who's able to help with childcare?
Now,
oh, it looks like we're streaming live on YouTube right now.
Oh yeah, they started it.
yeah, now it's okay, but before, yeah, I mean, like now it's okay, normalized. What are you both? What are you? I mean, I'm in Queens. Now things here are okay.
Yeah, I'm still in coronavirus chaos. I'm in I'm within spitting distance of Donald Trump's White House, about 45 minutes away on a farm.
At least you're
in a tiny house,
not in the city. I was supposed to fly to New York on March 13th.
Yeah.
And I just remembered, I woke up, I had my suitcase ready, and I was like, I'm not going.
Yeah.
And then that day, in the afternoon, the lockdown started in Europe.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, okay, so I missed it by the skin of my teeth, because otherwise I would have gotten stuck in New York.
Yeah, I had an apartment in Red Hook, a neighborhood in Brooklyn.
I know perfectly well. I lived there.
Yeah. So I they hadn't official. I think it was the day before that, maybe like March 12th. Like the order hadn't come down yet, but it was clear something was going to happen. Was the world ending? It wasn't clear. It's like, I'm going to move out of my New York apartment now and just head for the rural countryside and see, get a perspective.
It's just funny because, of course, it's another instance of white flight. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking a lot about that because recently I was. There is a work I have always wanted to make, which is about. Like, I'm seeing it again. Every person, a lot of my friends are now like upstate New York in some kind of, the ones that can.
And at the same time, there's also really interesting reconfigurations of the racial landscape. So, when I got here in rural Maryland, initially it was Trump flags everywhere and, don't tread on me signs and, people with MAGA hats. But then the shift happens, after the murder of George Floyd, and there was this massive rally, and a Black Lives Matter rally in Poolesville, Maryland, that never saw civil rights rallies in the 1960s.
I mean, it's interesting, that kind of like first world configuration of who gets to go outside of the city, yeah? Because I come from Mexico, and of course in Mexico, no one, I mean, like a kind of like market of wealth means city. You don't go start your organic farm nowhere.
Yeah, here local histories of migration. Let me just really quick.
Okay, sorry.
Local histories of migration here. Slavery happened here. Like the land that I'm on right now was likely cleared by slaves. We don't have those histories nailed yet, but yeah, like people from this small town decided to leave, and now they're in this moment, like some of the young Black Lives Matter activists are in this moment, like, can I imagine a livable future for myself in this rural agrarian landscape? And it's a very open question.
I mean, this is something, just to finish and then moving to our proper conversation, which don't worry, we are moving into agriculture, so it's anyway. I mean, because I have a child, of course, one of the things that I want is figure out how to leave the city. I mean, like, okay, and then you start having these like super survivalist images of like, okay, I need to buy a house, there needs to be a source of water nearby. There has to be a river. And you're like, well, okay, where, what kind of future am I anticipating for my child? Yeah, it's kind of like, anyway, on to the bees then.
Yeah.
Let's start. Thank you for this interesting incomes. We can continue maybe after. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to the 6th session of the 2nd season of Sheltering Places. During the next hour and a half, we will discuss questions around humans, non-humans, and nature relationships mediated by technology with our two amazing guests, Julieta Aranda and Eben Kirksey. Before introducing our theme, I would like to introduce our guests. So, Julieta Aranda is an artist born in Mexico City who currently lives and works between Berlin and New York. Central to Aranda's multidimensional practice are her involvement with the circulation mechanisms, her interest in science fiction, space travel, zones of frictions, and her interest in the possibilities for the production of political subjectivities by way of all of the above. As a co-director of eFlux, together with Anton Vidoko, Julieta has developed the project Time Bank, Pawn Shop, and eFlux Video Rental, all of which started in the eFlux storefront in New York and have traveled to many venues worldwide. Since 2008, Julieta has been the editor of eFlux Journal, together with Anton and Brian Cohn-Wood. Our other guest is Eben Kirksey. He attended the University of Oxford as a British Marshall Scholar and earned his PhD from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Often on the road, he lives between Australia and the United States. Currently, he is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Eben has taught at some of the most renowned and innovative higher education institutions, from Princeton University to Deep Springs College in the High Sierra Desert. In academic settings, Eben is perhaps best known for his work on multi-species ethnography, a field that uses innovative approaches to study human interactions with animals, microbes, fungi, and plants. His teaching repertoire includes popular lecture courses like Environment, Development, and Sustainability, as well as advanced seminars on human nature. His interdisciplinary offerings include environmental art, medical anthropology, as well as science and society. So the idea of this event is stemming from a micro study, an investigation I'm conducting in the field of beekeeping. I'm studying the impact of the forthcoming of digital technology within the practice of beekeeping itself. In short, this technology aims to record and monitor beehives by placing digital sensor within the hive itself. However, the technology comes with embedded politics, which is profit-driven and in the worst scenarios could take beekeepers out of the equation and end an ontological dance between bees and beekeepers that have taken place for 1,000 years. But why is there any interest there? As Anna Tsing puts it, it's because there is politics in this making of this technology, hence the need to act. The only interesting point I see during my investigation is the idea of less disturbance for bees. In other words, the possibility to create intimacy without proximity. This idea is borrowed from Jake Metcalf. Metcalf coined this idea while studying grizzly bears. The question of proximity to your subject when they are giant bears that can eat you alive seems quite obvious. However, how to relate this concept when it is us, humans, that endanger our subject of research, or simply species with which we share our worlds? Hence, for this event, I want to enlarge this micro idea to a macro one. Humans' relationship with non-human in nature is becoming increasingly mediated by digital apparatuses. From their use in farming, weather forecasting, to recognizing plants or submit via apps, we shed ourselves and develop intimacy without proximity. This conversation tackles the possibility of intervening in these processes from the film of art or humanities. Can these technologies help to recreate refuge and develop a more egalitarian relationships between humans, non-humans, and nature? Or will the electronic wasteland created by these technologies and their inherent biases only leave us doomed? To start, I would like to ask the first question to Julieta. You wrote an essay called Excess Output. In it, you raised a really important question, which is, I quote you, "What does the future look like for those lacking digital representation?" I would like to reappropriate this question and turn it into a question about non-humans' digital representation. What digital representation do they have? They actually seem to have an ambivalent position. At the same time, they are what you call digital hobbies. Indeed, they are on our backgrounds for their beauty, or they are numerous on YouTube to make us laugh. But at the same time, they lack any proper representation. How could we give non-human a better digital representation? Moreover, they never really represent themselves online. So could we imagine spaces for non-humans and nature to flourish online?
Thank you, Aladin, for the invitation. Sorry if you see something, talking about non-humans, if you see something coming across, it's my cat. Like one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, especially with regards to the ideas of that I bring up in excess output, is And when it comes to representation, it's like the set of relationships that we have developed for, oh my God, I can't believe this. Sorry. I can't believe
No worry.
Why exactly when I am speaking?
Maybe see who it is. Maybe they have an interesting.
No, it's you know, like the worst thing is that I know exactly who he is. He's the plumber. My dishwasher broke. It's
critical life support technology.
Exactly, like that. Never mind. So thank you for taking me out of my comfort zone of happiness and speaking. So now I'm feeling totally clumsy because, of course, I also lost my window and I don't see any.
Don't worry, take your time.
Eye contact that I had with you guys that made me feel that I was somewhere is gone. Why?
Intimacy without proximity.
Yeah,
you can still hear our voices though, right?
No intimacy, no proximity, no nothing here. Okay, I can't see you. Come on, a software update. I don't want a software update. I can. I mean, like, this is going to give me a lot of food for my answer. Not now. Okay, soon. Come back here. Yes, here we are. Okay. Okay. So, what I was like saying is like one of the things is that our relationships with non-human agents, let's say, are still determined through a colonial lens. So they are all they're kind of like seen through profit and use. Even when these are relationships where we claim to have the best of intentions, yeah. So of course the easy thing is like, yes, factory farming and how we relate to systems of monoculture and so on, but there is also issues of symbolic capital and the kind and ideas of becoming, yeah. So this is something I've been thinking a lot about when it comes, when I keep reading all this text, fantastic, beautiful text, where I am supposed to think about becoming plant or becoming animal and embodying the dispossessed and like those that have no voice. And what it makes me think is that I am expanding, and people that do that with the best of intentions are trying to expand their territory. Not content with only occupying the human sphere, now they want to become plant and actually completely crowd the plants from their kind of space by trying to embody a subjectivity that is actually, in the best of cases, purely imaginative, pure imagination and speculation, because how would I know what it's like to make photosynthesis? I have no clue. But this kind of like claiming of spaces, to me, is a colonial practice. So in order to think about representation, that is, and when I think about the digitally obese and so on, I do not think of background images as digitally, as something that belongs to the digitally obese. I think of those as poor images, as Hito Steyer describes them. Yeah? Like they are kind of like wallpaper, easily replaceable. So I think recently I was watching a documentary about it's a Mexican documentary that's called "I'm No Longer Here." That is, I don't know if any of you have seen it. If not, please watch it. It's pretty great. That it kind of like speaks about, in a way, to me at least, of what it's like to be extinct before you are extinct. Yeah, like to understand that you may be here, but you are paper thin. There's nothing to come after you. Like you are the end of the line. So when I think about the role of the digital in the set of relationships that we have with the non-human world, is that unless we apply a corrective to this kind, and I mean, I have no great answer, yeah? Like it's more about thinking that unless we apply a corrective to this kind of colonial logic, and I'm not even thinking about being anthropocentric or not, because I think this whole idea about becoming the other is trying to get out of the human-centric frame, which I still find colonial, yeah, and I still find super problematic. So finding a different frame is what would enable us to actually have a ground from where to build digital tools, or I don't even care if they are digital or not. I mean, like simple tools to relate to the, to the rest of the world next to us, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, if I might jump in before you ask me a question, Aladin, I've got some
jump in. I wanted to ask if you wanted
to riff on here, and I think for starters, like one of the ways that we can kind of reorient ourselves to critters that are around us is, one Haraway concept that I find particularly useful is that of encounter value. So it's not just how can we use these others, but how can we think about the terms of our encounter with others? And a frame that we've been playing with in the multi-species ethnography conversation for like the last 10 years is trying to push back explicitly against that framing of human, non-human. So, like non-white, non-human implies the lack of something. It implies, so it sort of reinforces the human as the central point of reference. And, in the multi-species idiom, we're trying to think about other beings that are in becoming, and about specificity in relation, so going back to Jake Metcalf's piece about intimacy without proximity, like for people, encountering grizzly bears in a mediated way is probably good if we want to keep, doing our thing. And for many animals, that's the same case. There's lots and lots of critters out there that don't like to be up close and personal with people. And I think this concept of intimacy without proximity is so important to rethink those possible relatings, those possible encounters that might be mediated by digital technologies that keep a distance, that keep a sense of, there's a number of folks who have explored this, with meerkats. Matt Candea looks at the way that you can have physical proximity with a meerkat, but it's not the like up close and playful kind of experience you would have with a dog. Like you can become a rock in effect if you're just like still enough, the meerkat stops noticing you, that you're an agential being that might be potentially harmful. But with some other kinds of life, like baboons, as Barbara Smuts has showed us, being a rock is really impolite. Baboon demands a sort of sociality if you want to have any sort of intimacy or relating. So I guess the multi-species idiom is trying to think about, again, that specificity of relation, again, moving past that idea of non-human, to think about these possible encounters and possible relatings. And I think in contrast to some of the modes of representation that are colonizing, that do seek to, basically speak for others. Latour has talked about this, and I don't think Latour ever read Spivak, who, reminds us that speech is always mediated, especially when you're dealing with subalterns. And, in human realms, there's at least the possibility of mediated transformative speech and that subaltern explosive moment where you can speak truth to power. But when we're dealing with other kinds of life where logocentric speech isn't possible or isn't probable in any rate, let's take this out of the realm of representation, but think about possible ontological relatings and tactful proposals we might generate for possible flourishing. And some of those tactful proposals are like, you stay over there, I'm going to stay here, we're going to get along in this shared world. But I also wonder to push back hard against that colonizing tendency of many of these representational technologies, and in creating these refugia that Aladin alluded to in the opening. How might we play with generative justice? So this is a term that Ron Eglash has introduced, coming out of open source software movements, thinking about peer-to-peer networks, queer affiliations, agroecology projects, indigenous federations, and projects of generative justice involve these nested regenerative loops where increases to biodiversity might come through a multiplicity of fungi, bacteria, plants, insects that emerge in these dynamic spaces of what I call in emerging ecologies, these spaces of generative disinterest. So one mode of intimacy without proximity is just like recognizing that generative capacity of compost, recognizing that generative capacity of these emergent social movements that that have the potential to disrupt long-standing hegemonic forces, whether we're talking about in the domains of race, in the domains of nationality, and in the domains of capital. So yeah, I guess for me, in thinking about these potentiality for refugia, for flourishing with others, and not just representing the other, but making a claim to a common future. It's about yeah, I think these mediated encounters that attend to the specificity of the desires, of the affects, of the worldings of others, and create space to be alongside, to speak alongside, but not to claim in any kind of mode of appropriation.
I mean, just to talk a little bit about the encounter itself, yeah, like the terms of the encounter.
Mm-hmm.
Why does a lot of the times when I see, not in what you are saying, but when I see these kinds of encounters of of poorly phrased ecological attempts, let's not what you are saying now, but when I see them poorly phrased, like what I'm referring at before with like the good intentions that I find problematic. Yeah, it's like even those encounters are like photo op encounters. Yeah, where the encounter requires me to be there. The encounter is about me encountering something, not about something encountering something else or something itself. So if I want to think about an encounter that would actually be generative, I would take myself out of the encounter. It's like introducing it's like matchmaking. Let me introduce you world. Let me introduce you to the world. I will fade. I will have like a webcam somewhere hovering above.
Yeah, the person who taught me about generative disinterest is someone who works as a maintenance worker, but also as kind of the leading person for a reforestation program at a school. It has elementary age kids up to high school, and this is in the highlands of Costa Rica. A man named Milton Brennis, and Milton in part is doing a Laturian project of interestment. He's attending to the needs and interests of multiple beings and trying to enlist them in a stable network, right? So he's got 12 plant species that he's putting in these lands that have been destroyed by cattle and capitalism, but now reclaimed by a community agroforestry project. So, he's thinking about, like, if I plant an inga, like that's gonna, bring future toucans and children that are interested in the fruit. Like if I plant chancho de monte, it's going to attract pigs with the nuts, and it's also a really good maderable. You can use it in building buildings. So it's something that the children who have a stake in the future are going to take an interest in. But even as he's trying to interest these others that are animals, these others that are children, these others that are future people, he's also encountering plants. So he talked to me about monte, which is in the Costa Rican idiom of Spanish, like a general word for weed, but also in this particular place, it was this bushy thing with like blue flowers. And we found all this monte, like something that other folks might class as a weed and try to kill, just emerging within this place. And monte for him became, he came to recognize, like, oh, monte facilitates all these other regenerative processes. So, there's all sorts of other seedlings that are going to come to get established on these bushes with monte. And he had a similar sort of attitude towards the compost system. He wasn't, he had worms in there, probably red worms from California, an invasive species, but still these alien others were helping engender this lively convivial space that was helping the tree seedlings get established. And Milton he didn't have a really clear like I want to kill this, I want to promote life of this in the compost. It's again kind of the stepping back. Like, so in those regions of monte, like he told people, yeah, just leave it alone for a while. Let's leave it alone for 5 years or 10 years and see what emerges. So for me, it's those spaces where we can step back and kind of see what emerges, but also make situated judgments of like, there's certain plants that had to be killed in order for this forest to reemerge. So an imported grass from by cattle ranchers from Africa, you know, that had to be killed for this forest to regenerate. It had rhizomes and sort of arboreal climbing processes, so it would go up and overshadow the whole emergent forest. So, you know, I think emergence and generative disinterest, when taken together with those situated judgments of agency and action, like that can create these spaces of refuges and spaces where we can step back and not do the photo op selfie.
That kind of encounter actually speaks to me, where it's like, of course, you know, there is a sense where you realize, I don't know, there are, you know, like a bit too many cats or a little bit too many weeds, and then there is like a balancing act that, because of how much interference has been in the past, the systems are not self-regulated at the moment. So yes, one can step in as needed to promote this kind of equilibrium. So yes, that makes sense. That speaks to me. Yeah, like the much more.
Or I'd actually push back on that notion of equilibrium. You know, like earlier systems theorists like saw the ecosystem as a stable entity. But if you kind of go back past the 1950s to the 1920s, you see this debate between Clements and Gleason about what constitutes an ecological community. And, you know, one of them is arguing, you know, it's a superorganism. You take away a part or add a part, you know, the thing collapses. And the other, you know, old school ecologists, and really kind of some of the first people to define ecology as a discipline, you know, they're looking at long patterns over geological time where contingent assemblages of critters come together. So I think in a moment, it's really easy. I mean, and of course we inherit all sorts of horrible colonial and capitalist legacies of introducing industrial organisms that have radically disrupted natal ecologies. But at the same time, while we're living with those troubling legacies that we can't ever go back to, like, can't imagine this like final piece, this final solution, you just eradicate the rogue and, you know, you're left with the Eden that once was before capitalism or colonialism. We don't have that. So how to live with these others that, you know, are often aliens, and at least if you're using that idiom of ecology, it's not about a homeostasis, but it's about a dynamic equilibrium, or what some ecologists call intermediate disturbance.
I mean, I'm talking more or less about something like that, and I think one of the things that has made me consider those kinds of systems more closely is not the long, you know, like long lasting systems, but something I'm quite obsessed with these days, which are whale falls.
Say again, whale pods?
You know, when the carcass of a whale falls to the abysmal depth and becomes an ecosystem for a length of time.
Tell me more. I don't know anything about them, or know very little.
You know, as a whale dies, the carcass falls to the bottom of the sea, and for a length of time becomes an ecosystem. It's very much like the trees that become like mother trees once they have been felled. And that process, the amount of time it takes for that particular object, the whale carcass, or a mother tree to reintegrate itself into the landscape and the kind of system that develops around it. Those are the kind of systems that I have been looking at.
Cool.
Yeah, or like also just boat wreckage. It's a bit the same idea, maybe on a longer period. And then
which one?
Like a boat, or like a boat wreckage, or I don't know, boat.
Like diving. I mean, like, well, like
a boat that sink, or like, yeah, it's basically that.
I mean, they do. I mean, there has been all these kind of attempts now to revitalize coral reefs by seeding coral into everything from school buses to sculptures to whatnot. One of my favorite diving sites, I dive very often. One of my favorite diving sites is in Mar de Cortés, in the northern California, in Baja California, sorry, in Mexico. And it's a 1940s cargo ship. And the cargo consisted of toilets. You go, it's fantastic because you go down, it's like quite down, and a number of octopuses have settled in the toilet bowls. It's
To me, that sounds like an excellent place for selfies. Yeah. Sitting on the toilet with the octopus like reaching over your shoulder.
Yeah, I mean, you, Eben, answer a bit like the second question I wanted to ask you, but basically we can maybe just rephrase it a little bit and think we need basically to withdraw ourselves for some type of relationship with non-humans, or we need to have this proximity without this intimacy without proximity. And I would maybe just build on this and ask you, like, do you see any hope for the question of hope is quite recurrent in your work and something that really interested me. And I was wondering, do you see any hope for flourishing multi-species in the cyber culture, or like any space for this?
Yeah, so I guess I think of hope like the pharmacon, the poison that can be the cure in the right dose. And in some of my work, I've looked at unexploded bombs as sort of figures of hope. So there's these parts of Panama where the U.S. military basically went out into the jungle and did target practice. And sometimes this was just like shooting at things, and other times this was like, lobbing major munitions, dropping bombs from planes, and a percentage of those bombs didn't explode. And when Panama reestablished sovereignty over the Canal Zone, the Pentagon refused to clean up the mess. And right now, those bombs are still there, and occasionally they explode and kill people or kill animals. But at the same time, in effect, they've protected these zones from capital, from the intrusion of development projects. I mean, there's still some parts, like for major capital intensive projects, like the expansion of the Panama Canal, like they've invested the money to clear out these munitions, and also the Tocumen airport, they've cleared off some of these spaces. But it's also a question of hope for whom, right? So you get tapirs, you get jaguars, you get spider monkeys, you get all sorts of animals that are in decline in Central America. But at the same time, you have this hegemonic idea of nature that is in the service of elites. So these zones are not places where you can safely go hunting. And the whole sort of canal zone nature project that's kind of been created by the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian has a research station that's been there for almost 100 years, very much part of the US imperial adventure in Panama. And for that 100-year history, you've seen local campesinos who were living in this place before it was dammed, before it was created into this major site of capital. They've been systematically excluded from these zones of nature. So like local hunting rights were not respected. And so, okay, so you've got these places that organizations like Conservation International and others deem as like, some of the wildest and most pristine, first of all, both of those words are troubling, right? Pristine and wild, areas of Central America. But it's all about disappearing entanglements between communities that have intergenerational connections to this land and supporting this imperial idea of nature. So I think anytime we're thinking about hope, it's always hope for whom. And, thinking about it as a pharmacon is also thinking about how poisonous it can become, and that cruel optimism sense of Lauren Berland.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just made a joke. I just thought about hydroxychloroquine just because of the.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
But just like thinking about that, because what you're talking about now is something that I find very interesting, because it brings us to symbolic capital. Yeah, like that also has to do with the colonial relationships, and with something that's been happening for the last 20 years, let's say, which is the symbolic capital that is inherent in clean living and in ideas of wellness, and in a kind of like very, very selfish view of what the world has to be or ought to be, and for whom, as you are saying, right? So basically, where you see that ancestral technologies get repackaged and resold. So basically now if I think about what is happening in my country, which is Mexico, I see that fairly ancestral ways of doing things were deemed inoperative and obsolete, and now are being repackaged and resold at a premium by people that these technologies, I want to call them technologies in purpose, did not belong to begin with. Or when I think about a place like Matera in Italy, right, it was this like I believe a troglodyte settlement. That in the 1950s, the Italian government kicked people out of, saying, okay, you're living like pigs, you're living like animals, this is not a place for humans, you are like disgusting, you are bringing a bad name to the Italian situation. Off you go to a project building. And now, like fast forward 30 years, and now that exact same troglodyte settlement is being lived in the way the original inhabitants of Matera lived, except that the people that live there now are architects and forward thinkers, let's say, people like us, more or less. So that troubles me a lot, yeah, because in the same way of feeling that there is the danger there of being like the poison that I want to not, to kind of like find my way around. So how to make sure that actually the knowledges and the environments and the situations, who do they belong to? Yeah. I mean,
yeah. And I think one text that I've always found useful for that question of belonging is Michel Serres' The Parasite, where he just questions the relation between the host and the guest. And we're all living with parasites, right? And in more or less comfortable ways. Like there's a classic piece from the medical anthropology literature by Michael Brown that talks about microparasites and macroparasites. The microparasites are filarial worms and malaria and dengue and cholera and all these things that we can identify medically and isolate. But then the macroparasites are the landlords, and in the case of contemporary agriculture projects, insurance agents and chemical companies, and some of the ways that these other agents parasitize us. And if you go back to Marx, like he's actually one of the earliest theories of non-human agency. The idea of capital is a parasite that sort of infects the human and bends the will of the human to make more of itself. Like the conscious purpose of the capitalist is to make more capital. So it's this parasitic possession. And we're all multiply mediated. We're all mediated by these political and economic forces, but also, as we know from the microbiome, our gut makes us who we are. I learned something last week that blew my mind on that note. Heroin, lots of folks for at least 10 years have been talking about the gut microbes, the bacteria, the fungi, the protists that are sort of living with us. But if you look at the human genome, and this is totally old news, this is like news from 20 years ago in genomics, like we're mostly virus. If you look at the human genome, over 50% of the coding genes that make us are these repeating viral elements. So, that totally, and, like viruses with reverse transcriptase like HIV and others that are related to HIV are constantly infecting our genomes, making us become other. And I think, it's like in this moment of COVID time, when a virus has attenuated human agency on an unimaginable scale. Like 6 months ago, we could not have imagined this moment.
Yeah, we had imagined it, but we
sure.
Because we were already resigned to a 50-year timeline. As the polar caps melted, the world was
right.
So it just
went. I mean, it had been imagined otherwise. Like all the outbreak movies are about like the way that the military like mobilizes and squelches this diseased continent where like let's burn the village where all the black people have this horrible disease before we'll sacrifice some soldiers, but it's going to be okay, we're going to save civilization. And yeah, the climate imaginaries are also a little otherwise. But yeah, it's an amazing moment where our agency has been attenuated in this kind of global scale, and yeah, it's I guess forcing us to imagine possible intimacies without proximity.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, Aladin, I think you've come up with a brilliant phrase to frame our conversation today.
So maybe like the discussion seems to stem in the right direction about, and now we can maybe swift a bit to like the idea of technology that it's needed for this intimacy without proximity. So I would ask just Julieta the other question about in his book, like Symbolic Technology, like Stanisław Lam asked this, like, does technology cause us or do we cause it? Does it lead us wherever it wishes, even to perdition, or can we make it bend before our pursuit? I would just briefly ask you the same question, like, can we make it bend for our pursuit?
I mean, yeah, I think that it's not so, I cannot see technology as like as a fatal thing, you know, like that we are following where it leads us. Of course, we bend it to our desires. The point is, what are our desires? And then the question for me is, can we change our desires? Can we change what we want out of it? Yeah. So I don't think that, you know, technology in that sense is kind of like pretty dumb. Yeah. It's like a knife and a fork. It's not this dark force trying to lead us into the dark realm. Is what do we want it for? So it's, you know, like, would it be possible to limit this kind of like expansive desire? Yeah, like this, like if we manage to curb that, which has nothing to do with technology, it has to do with a whole host of other things. Yeah. But if we would manage to curb and understand our desire and our position and our relation and our encounters with others, then of course the technology could be, you know, great for mediating our encounters, and we could use it for the things that it needs to be used. Like case in point, Zoom. Yeah, this is our intimacy these days. Yeah. This is like what we call the public space for the last 6 months has become this like fragmented little windows, and it's all being mediated by corporations. Yeah, the public space right now is a fairly corporate realm because it's all Zoom, Skype, Facebook, whatnot. And I'm thankful they exist because I would be losing my mind without. Now, the point is, what do I want to get out of it? Yeah. Same question. I mean, like, I'm using this as an example because it's of course an extremely corporate landscape. All our public interactions right now are so mediated, and so it's easier to look at them from our own species setup without thinking about, you know, the jaguars and the microbes. But you know, like, then I think everything that I have seen the last 6 months is a kind of, it's like prepackaged and so on, and appealing to some kind of like mediatized common denominator. And I see Italian people singing, and I read these op-ed letters in newspapers from, I'm talking to my infected self of the future, and so on. Yeah, and I try to find, when I'm reading this and I'm consuming news now more than I ever did before, I try to find the desire underneath. Yeah, like, and where is this going? And does this mean that we hit the limits, the limits of imagination in terms of how to envision the future, and then we are caught in a loop? That's what I think sometimes. And then how do we push through? Yeah? What is on the other side of that? I don't want to, I mean, like, I'm gonna use a Haraway phrase now, which is that I want to stay with the trouble. You know, like, I think like the only thing that makes sense now is to stay with the trouble and try to live it through, not fast forward, not go to the other side of this. And, you know, in 2 years when traveling is possible again and you can hug your friends because it's, you know, I can't imagine that. And that fracture of imagination, I find it an incredibly productive place, as this, you know, as frightening and as difficult and, you know, white knuckles. I can think, I can see anything else. I don't find the point in making my own artwork. What's going on? that spot, that place, that trouble is where I find that desire is going to come from. Yeah, like the will to bend and to find a new direction for technologies and for relationships, and what gets me, how do we mediate and what is that gets mediated, if it's to get better, would come from this particular trouble. Enough rant.
So on that point, I've just finished a book about CRISPR Cas9 and all of the hope and the hype and the desires that have been attached to this molecule that can change DNA. And some of the desires are quite expansive. Imagining these radical transformations to the human condition. And it's not only what desires get attached to the technology, but kind of whose get closer to reality. So the book chronicles some of the first edited people in the world, the very first edited people. For starters, that metaphor of editing, I don't agree with. I think CRISPR works more like a Reaper drone that sometimes takes out the target, but sometimes takes out the whole wedding party.
You mean?
Yeah, CRISPR Cas9 is this genetic engineering. Yeah. So
I was thinking about weren't there those Chinese? I think were twins that were like.
Yeah, my book's all about them. I got insider access to that lab. So,
I have to talk with you a lot.
Yeah, we can have a long conversation, but in part it's a queer story about gay and bisexual desires that are unfulfilled in contemporary China. So the families who signed up for the experiment, first of all, were living in these complicated social fictions that get called fake marriages by the straight women who find themselves entangled with a gay or bisexual man. But there's all sorts of ethical things to explore. But yeah, I mean, for some people in that particular experiment, the desire was for engaging in a CRISPR study was just the very simple desire of reproductive futurity. So for them, being gay, being HIV positive, in a country where gay marriage is not allowed, where if you have an STD, you can't use standard reproductive technology. For them, the only way that they could make a baby was for this crazy over-the-top first-in-man experiment. So that was a very modest desire that got fulfilled with this profoundly disruptive techno-fix. But I'm also chronicling in the United States, the first edited people, if we're going to stick with that metaphor. And again, I think it works more like a drone that blows things up and sometimes goes awry. They were HIV positive activists who'd been fighting for experimental cutting edge medicine since the early 1990s. So members of the ACT UP collective were the ones who put their bodies on the line for gene editing trials. And what I found is like halfway through this experiment, when they had promising results, where they'd repaired the immune systems of some people who'd been living with a borderline cell counts that were so close to an AIDS diagnosis, even though they were able to control the virus, this technology had real promise of improving their lives. The company had an insider trading scandal. One of the scientists went to jail, and they decided it was more lucrative to use these gene editing technologies to pursue other diseases. So for me, it's those moments of sometimes strategic alignment, these strange compromises and coalitions that you see between activists, patients, corporate executives, government officials.
There is a lot of politics that go into this kind of technologies. Yeah, I have my own modest stories. Like I'm a single mom by choice, so I did use reproductive technology to have a child. And I had to actually find a doctor in Germany that would allow me as a single mom. It's like there is a law, for example, that requires that a child has the right to a father. And I was like, but it's like, it became a very convoluted legal process because there was just none. It was, so of course, the politics inherent to all these things, and navigating the kind of law to find a doctor that actually would raise a legal, like a lawsuit against the German government to allow people that, non-couples to actually engage in reproductive technology, so that it's only, because it's its own mess, yeah. But if it was for the German government, for example, reproductive technology would only be available to couples that are having fertility issues. It would not be available to same-sex couples or to women like me. It's a similar thing to the CRISPR story, yeah.
Totally, and I think back on Aladin's question of technology and desire and who are kind of where it's all headed. I always turn back to Alondra Nelson's work, The Social Life of DNA, where she looks at, for starters, like the promise of genomic medicine, like that was where all the hope and the hype was, but really it mostly delivered people to jail, at least for like the last 20 years or so. We're only now starting to see the first gene therapies. But at the same time, Alondra is really good at chronicling the ways that activists and others appropriated the technology as soon as it was released for other political projects. So now, it's used in cases where ancestors of slaves are suing insurance companies who made money off of the unpaid labor of their ancestors. It's used.
This has to do with desire as well, yeah. Like, like pushing through. Desire is not an agenda. It's something a lot more unruly. So, how can you take this and actually map it onto the technology to this kind of of course I'm not using this is like a very liberal use of terms, but I would want to use this idea of desire, this kind of like excessive thing, this more I don't know, as opposed to an agenda, as opposed to a profit-driven agenda, like something that is desire-driven and that is simply like a mode of life, in the sense of not the life of capital, but the life that has as a mission to actually put itself in a situation where it can continue.
And even just like taking a simple thing like, what's become a banal technology, that has all kinds of agendas embedded in it, whether it's, like the factory complexes in Shenzhen, China, where, laborers are committing suicide because of the horrible working conditions, or, the complicated ways that our data is getting collected and mined by companies like Google. But now there's a project in Kalimantan, a remote part of Indonesia, where used smartphones are being used to do surveillance of logging companies. So you've got I have seen that. Yeah, you've got these like legal fictions on paper. Like we've got this conservation zone, but there's no government investment in park rangers. So they've trained the cell phones. They've invented an app and like just put a little umbrella over it to protect it from the rain, to listen to chainsaws. And if it hears chainsaws, it like tweets or something, and then the officials can show up and investigate the where the chainsaw is coming from. So I think it's like these creative modes of appropriation. This is what we know going back to Cyborg Manifesto, the early Haraway. Like, how can we appropriate these informatics and technologies?
Exactly.
You went exactly where I wanted to actually drive you, Eben. But yeah, this idea, you talk about technofix, and Julieta, you kind of rejected also this idea of like, I don't know, we could say like technological determinism. And I know that, Eben, you worked also with different indigenous communities, and I would like to know if you can, because I did study a bit of what you call like indigenous media, and we always tell like to avoid any technological determinism and to find way out. Actually, sometimes technology is used in a different way, in a surprising way. And I think your example with the phone for logging company is exactly that. And I would like, maybe if you can elaborate on this, like, and is there any way there or any way of get some clue for?
Yeah, I first went to Indonesia at the age of 17 as an exchange student, and I picked it out of a brochure. As a bored kid in high school, I wanted to go to a place that had biodiversity and diverse cultures. And I eventually ended up in this milieu where there was a genocide and a revolution happening. So the Indonesian military invaded West Papua in 1961. And ever since, there's been this sustained campaign of killing that hardly anybody knows about. There's the biggest gold mine in the world there, Freeport-McMoran, and a US company. And there's basically a media blackout about this place. And at the same time, there's a very vibrant indigenous resistance movement. And my first book and PhD were all about that struggle for freedom and the surprising collaborations that emerged. And I think, like Black Lives Matter here, you know, emergent political formations all over the world, the use of cell phones, the emergence of social media, you know, all these forms that, you know, have their roots, like the internet has its root in a Pentagon project, right? DARPA invented the internet, the military invented this technology, but it's being appropriated and reappropriated in all these complicated ways. So, you know, there's now all of a sudden new modes of making visible violence against Black bodies, whether that violence is taking place in the US or West Papua or Southern Sudan. And, you know, I think we're all trying to reckon with, you know, what that means for possible political futurities. And I think a lot of social fictions are being exposed right now. Like we have this Enlightenment ideal that, you know, all humans are deserving of rights. And, you know, anyone who's done any work on human rights knows that that actually doesn't pertain to how power works in this world. So, you know, increasingly the general public is being made aware of that. And a lot of it is through the savvy use of media. So if you happen to be my friend on Facebook, you're going to get a lot of friends from Papuan activists who kind of like rhizomes are trying to penetrate and interpenetrate international networks. So, you know, things will start appearing in your Facebook feed that are horrific and you might not have imagined are taking place in this contemporary reality. But yeah, I've seen some horrible pictures, you know, pictures that a Catholic woman in the Philippines who has a family of 5 might deem unappropriate for Facebook. But, you know, we're figuring out how to effectively leverage these technologies of mediation to create, maybe intimacy is the wrong word in these situations. I mean, it's incredibly, I mean, I remember like the first time I saw a picture of one of these dismembered bodies. It was in a much earlier technology. It looked like a photo book that you might like see like your parents' pictures in. It had like a brown cover, kind of puffy, and the little like plastic sleeves for the pictures to go in. And I opened it up thinking I was going to see like someone's high school or college graduation pictures. And it was this body that had been cut into 12 pieces. And that, like, the world just kind of, you know, reconfigured, I guess. And I spent like 1.5 years of my life trying to get to the bottom of that person's story. He was a 32-year-old health worker named William Corwam. I eventually got to talk to his family members, his sister, his mom. And yeah, the ways that people are being dehumanized, I think the emergence of these new technologies of visualization, of mediation, of social connection, you know, it's an open question. Is this kind of violence still going to be possible? And I think you see the same thing on the U.S.-Mexico border right now. You know,
I see the same thing, not only the U.S.-Mexico border, I see the same thing through the entirety of Mexico, because the violence there is going on, like, you know, like strong as ever. And it has become, it's to the point that it's completely, people are completely desensitized to it. Like it has become as we know, everything can become normal. So there is a new normal in that sense where, you know, if you're taking your child to the playground, you actually have to go ahead a little bit because there is a chance that you will find a dismembered body there. So you maybe want to, you know, or the way that it is in the US where children have to do, I don't know if you know this, I know a lot of things about children being a mom, but you know, in order to make preschool kids practice lockdowns, they have to sing this song like lockdown, lockdown, close the door, now be quiet, say no more, let's go under the desk and hide, let's wait till it's safe outside. And that's the way that they normalize, you know, that they kind of like internalize Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. So yeah, I mean, but I'm gonna grab from what you were saying before we go into dismemberments and like all this like violent things, the idea of enlightenment, you know, that you were talking about, because the idea of enlightenment is predicated, of course, in one particular mode of what does it mean to be enlightened. So it's I mean, like the problem with the notion of enlightenment is that it's there is like one modality of being that it's superior to all others. So it creates a set of hierarchies as to who is more enlightened at whom and upon following which model. So it precludes it's a very homogenizing concept at the end of the day. So if like taking back from my knowledge of biology, like a homogeneous system dies. You want a heterogeneous system. So how do we create a heterogeneity where all possibilities have the same value of being enlightened, right? I mean, and I'm not talking, like in this sense, I'm like not talking about modes of violence, yeah, but modes of being, cultural modes of being, where I don't have to think that this is more primitive than, or that I should aspire to that. And I think a lot of the mediation process, and that's the problem, why I was grabbing this, is where the imagination for the future has been coming from is a very homogenizing subset of images, yeah? So where we see the future as a singular thing, not a multiplicity of futures, but there is like a future. So I think that unless in the mediation process, we start making room for many, many futures, yeah, like whatever that, I mean, like not only in terms of what that means for other agents, not us, but even for the different versions of us. I mean, like I'm thinking in terms of, modes of being, like the hinterlands, like, like what it's, I mean, like how to get out of this idea of what it is to be well and what it is to be properly mediated. Yeah.
Super interesting stuff. So in particular, you were saying something about, I mean, yeah, I'm completely on board with your figuration of the Enlightenment subject. It's a white man who wasn't holding slaves in Greece, or, like there's various reincarnations of that, but, that is still the figure of the enlightened subject, whether that's in the judicial system of the United States or, but it's kind of become heterogeneous and multiplied a little bit, but you still see like projects of justice from a state point of view, like the justice system perpetuating horrible injustices. And so right now, I'm engaged in a 3-year project called The Promise of Multi-Species Justice with one of my former students, Sophie Chow. Anna Singh is part of the conversation. Michael Martyr and a number of other scholars, and we're really trying to reckon with this idea of justice, because so many injustices have been perpetuated in the name of justice. If you go back again to Kant, he's got this phrase, let justice be done even if it destroys the world, basically. And you see the foundational violence of nationalist and state visions of justice, but at the same time, there's forms of distributive justice that, or even reparative justice, that in many ways kind of reify existing hegemonic forces. So you're like a distributive justice claim is making a claim on existing institutions of power, whereas generative justice is kind of this, trying to establish again those kind of nested regenerative loops where you kind of get alternatives to these hegemonic forces. But I think like living in Corona time, living in the time of disproportionate death of Black and brown folks, at least in the US, I mean, complicated national stories are happening everywhere, but we're finding in this multi-species justice conversation a real difficulty in coming up with an idea of valuing life or attributing rights or justice to categories of life at this moment where human life is very vulnerable. I don't know. I'd love to draw you out more on this point. Like for starters, like, since we see a failing of human rights, like thinking about rights in multi-species contact zones, like, can we get beyond the place where we're privileging the human as the rights-bearing subject, even though the human kind of breaks down under critical scrutiny? So
who was a very recent quote? This is something that has stuck in my head for the last month or 2 months. American politician, disgraceful human being, that said there are more important things than living. You know, when he was being told that, okay, you know, like if we reopen the economy, people are going to die, and he said, well, there are more important things than living. And I was, wow, okay. I mean, what a gem of the present moment. Yeah, like what a way to capture the present moment. Of course, I mean, like I think that, of course, you know, like we cannot wait until we have done everything right by us in order to make, you know, it's, I mean, parallel processes. Yeah, like we can try to work on multi-species justice, let's say, as we work in human justice. I was something that I've been following quite closely is water rights in Central America. And like the kind of like the loopholes and the personhoods that has been applied to like certain territories in order to preserve the water rights, and which are like kind of like, you know, trying to play upon the weaknesses and strengths and equivalences of a judicial system. So as to, what was, I mean, like it started in Cochabamba, I believe it was. I don't know if you know the case.
Yeah, I know a little bit about it through the work. Well, Christina Lyons is doing some really interesting work in Colombia about both some of these foundational cases that attributed legal personhood to you know, landscapes and watersheds that were kind of rooted in community-based struggles, but then also at the same time, the elite community of Bogota, like the community of judges and legal rights activists trying to respond to a global moment, ended up passing some legislation and making some rulings that then were sort of forcing people in rural communities to reconfigure their modes of life, that the modes of life that were already very much attuned to like the Buen Vivir movement and like Pachamama and these alter worldings that are, I think, important ways of imagining futurity and justice that are outside of a Western legal idiom.
Because this is kind of like together with the idea of being able to imagine futures and enlightenment. Yeah, like of course, the imposition to, okay, reconfigure that because it's kind of like primitive and stupid to be thinking about Pachamama and like that, you know, like that. I mean, irrespective of what I think about Pachamama, you know, like I do not wish for indigenous modes of being to be eradicated on the pursuit of some kind of enlightened. You know, let's all, I don't know, wear at leisure and do yoga and enjoy, you know, appreciate the nature around us and meditate, you know, like in a kind of like detached Marie Kondo kind of way. I mean, like, no, I wouldn't the relationship to the landscape to be as such. But I mean, like, I think that it's, you know, like I was interested in that is because it seemed to me kind of cunning in a very good way to try to use the same failing legal system that was damaging communities to try to protect themselves. Yeah, like, so this attempt, irrespective of how well or not well it has worked, it has not worked in 90% of the cases, but the attempt, yeah, like the idea that someone can try to articulate a legal system that works across the board.
Yeah.
That is what I want to take from there, you know, that it's possible to, if we can imagine it, then it's possible. And at least somebody's already trying to imagine it, so.
And I think that goes back to Aladin's question about hope. I don't just see hope as toxic. And I think there's those moments of arrival where you got to appreciate what's shifted. So with DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, you know, for years, the Standing Rock movement was trying to derail that project. And finally, we have a legal ruling that is temporary, you know, that they have to stop the pipeline for the moment. There might be a future ruling that kind of reverses the current moment. But I think, you know, what I found working with indigenous visionaries in West Papua is that, you know, sometimes you have to engage with dreams that push the bounds of realism and realistic possibility, and then also attend to the concrete work that it takes to take those dreams and kind of manifest them in the historical present. And often when the thing that you hope for, and this is again what Lauren Berlant teaches us, when the thing that you hope for arrives, that can be profoundly disappointing when all the things that you imagine don't immediately happen. You know, you see this in I mean, it's hard to trash talk Barack Obama right now, but like, you know, people had profound hopes, like just from the perspective of West Papua, you know, like, yeah, you know, the Papuan people hoped that Barack Obama would finally recognize them as human beings and like use the power of the US military to, you know, bring, you know, because Obama's father was an Indonesian soldier who toured in West Papua and actually killed Papuans. So Papuans hold on to that historical memory, and they were hopeful, like, okay, here's this Black president, like he's going to recognize us as humans and he's going to intervene in this place where America has a long-term responsibility. Like, no, that didn't happen. But at the same time, many amazing things did happen in the Obama administration, and you can definitely see that from the perspective of, you know, the contemporary reality in the White House. But I think it's in those moments of arrival when that dream that might have seemed unrealistic, you know, the first, like imagining a Black man in the White House, like 100 years ago, that's just like pie in the sky, totally wacko, wild dreaming, and that arrived, and you know, reality shifted. And I think with these legal decisions that give people an opportunity to reframe the conversation about capital, about indigenous territory sovereignty, like all of these kinds of things. Yeah, these are all piecemeal and contingent arrivals. And I think the question is what to do with hope in those moments of arrival. You can either be disappointed and bummed and like stop hoping for things because a given figure of hope doesn't actualize everything you imagined, or you can re-territorialize your hope. You can grab onto something new. You can engage in that expansive dreaming. And this is, I think, where art practice is so important. You can just derail those dominant imaginaries, those dominant modes of dreaming, and reach into the future and grab onto something new, and then actualize that in the present. So that's what I call the messianic multiple, where hope kind of moves like liquid mercury. It grabs on and coalesces around different figures and re-territorializes and grabs onto other things. So those are things that, yeah, I explored in the context of West Papua, but I think might travel to other places.
Yeah, before leaving you some little floor for conclusion, I would just pick one question from the audience, from Andrew, which is an interesting question, like, how do you both understand the law as another technology for resistance? How can creative interventions with the law counteract the legal fictions that work to compartmentalize different forms of life? It's in the chat if you want to read it. Okay, yeah, I think I would like to read it.
Go ahead, Julieta, if you, I feel like we talked around the first part of that question, but I'm going to have to puzzle through the second part.
You know, it's so funny. Recently, I was talking, I mean, like this is, I'm beating around the bush a little bit to begin, yeah. But very recently, I was talking with Anton, with whom I have worked for a long time, and he was complaining about legal frameworks in the artistic domain, yeah, like the idea of what it would be to, he was like pondering if he would want to make an artwork about law and so on, which made me, you know, like it sounded very dry at the beginning, but then I keep thinking, now that I'm trying to put this together with the, you know, how, I mean, I don't know, I mean, what was it? Somebody that's very good at trying to imagine these kinds of things. Me, I'm not. Like, the law becomes a territory that is very obtuse for me in terms of like seeing it create. I can appreciate when somebody sees it creatively. To me, it's hard, but I see the work that has been done by, I mean, Michael Moore would be quite a good example, yeah. Or like the movie The Corporation. I think movies are quite a good.
Or the yes men are revolting.
Yeah, exactly. You know, things like that. Yeah, like I think that it takes a kind of it's not only the hope thing that you are describing. That I I have called something quite similar to that optimism. I think I am always a little bit afraid of the idea of hope, because it sounds, it's a little bit religious somehow, but humor tends to be always implicated in this kind of approach somehow. Yeah, like because there is something so preposterous as trying to stretch the limits of a legal case. But yeah, I mean, like I'm trying to figure out how can I mean, and of course, you know, like it comes to the point where you have to then rewrite things. Yeah, I mean, what was this another fantastic? I actually did make a work about that. The copyright issue with the monkey. You know, there's this monkey, a Sulawesi macaque that took a photograph of himself, and then the copyright issues became an issue. You know, like who has copyrighted the image, who took the image, and if was it the photographer, or does it belong to the photographer or to the monkey? And the issue of the personhood of the monkey, not the macaque, was quite contested. So, of course, there is like a creative limit there. But if we push it, yeah, like I mean, it's not about the Sulawesi macaque needing to profit from the image, but what the opening of that door could make possible for ecosystems and for sets of species. And, you know, could somebody then serve actually a jail term for separating, you know, a Sulawesi macaque from its babies, yeah, or from, I don't know, breeding tigers, or, you know, whatever it is. So, like, once you start pushing, there are really practical applications to the law. So, I mean, that's the kind of like thing that I could think about.
So back in the human realm, I engaged in something of a very serious performance art piece. So I witnessed a massacre in 1998, and upwards of 157 people were killed, and nothing ever happened. This was in West Papua. So on the 15-year anniversary of that, we basically held a citizens tribunal about the massacre. And those of us who were witnesses and survivors, some who were tortured on the day, came together to give testimony with retired judges and politicians and prosecutors who had quite a national and international renown. Ultimately, nothing happened. I mean, you know, the law has not been applied in this case, but in part it was a diagnostic, just imagining within the existing political and economic configurations and the ways that the law functions, imagining this otherwise. And I think, you know, the question is about legal fictions that work to compartmentalize different forms of life. And I could imagine all sorts of other performative tribunals being staged. And, you know, it doesn't have to be as serious as the one, you know, we were talking about really horrible stuff, but I could imagine like all kinds of playful, fun tribunals.
I mean, like just to take it, to try to have a go at it again. I mean, like, of course, the law, the justice, the tribunal, the court is a performative space. Yeah, it's look at the wigs. I mean, you know, look at the hammer. It's really a performative moment. So, and it's not a written performance. Yeah, it's like an improv, let's say. So what's interesting is also to think about that. I mean, like that the law is not particularly set in stone, especially when it comes to technology, for example. Yeah, like so much can still be written and so much still can be legislated. So I think that creative interventions, especially when it comes to this field, can become actually like a very like promising territory for modes of resistance.
I'm also thinking of Annie Sprinkle and Beth Stevens, their marriage ceremony they performed with Golly Mountain. So this is part of the ecosexual movement, and their legal fiction was that they married this mountain. And you know, Yeah, they married a mountain, and it's kind of quasi-erotic too. You know, Annie Sprinkle is known for her lesbian erotica, and you know, together they're this dynamic performance art couple, and yeah, this marriage ceremony, and there's a movie, it's called Goodbye Golly Mountain, that everybody can watch. But this marriage ceremony basically engaged with the mountain as a legal person, and reframed the conversations about mining and conservation in this zone. So I think, you know, there's all kinds of room for artists to intervene in these spaces.
Recently, I was thinking about like psychoanalytical theory. I think I don't know if I'm going in the text that you were referring to, the access output text. I think I talk about that, Aladin, a little bit, because I was like thinking about how the bulk of psychoanalytical theory that we read and that we go by is fairly outdated when it comes to technology. It doesn't take into account new tools. So I've been thinking for quite a while now of these things, the cell phones, as transitory objects, yeah, like in the psychoanalytical sense, a little bit like your blanket or your teddy, like this thing that mediate, you know, that is like, or like your mom's breast, you know, that it occupies this kind of like gray space. It's not just it's not just an object. It's not like your computer. It's like the thing that enables all your relationships, all your sense of security, especially if you are like a completely atomized human being that has been traveling and is, you know, like no family, no real relationships, and so on. So I thought a lot about that when a friend of mine or someone that I know had a nervous breakdown and had to be hospitalized for a while. And one of the first rules that were given to her was, okay, surrender your devices. And because now you can only have conversations with your loved ones, but her loved ones were very far away. So of course she had no way to, you know, by having to surrender her devices, she had no means to have those meaningful conversations she was being encouraged to have. So I've been trying to figure out, I mean, or, you know, even to think about writing like those texts that can reframe these technological objects, not only as devices, but also as affective devices, and as and in that same sense, that they are not fully understood in you know, in their psychological impact, let's say. I think their legal ramifications are also, I mean, like you see that with, you know, cyberbullying, yeah? Like somebody convinced somebody else to kill themselves a couple of years ago, teenagers. So the legislation on the case, like they have no precedent to legislate on that, yeah? Like, so does that, I mean, like, was that person there? Did she hold the gun? Did she, like, no, she just, like, she was just texting this kid. So it makes me think of this famous Ibsen play, where, I mean, it's also like a trope of literature where, you know, it's like, okay, you can be very rich if you know, like somebody will die, then you will become very rich. You do not need to know who that person is. And so this kind of like detachment from makes me think of drone pilots as well. Yeah, like you can get post-traumatic stress disorder, even if you're just a drone pilot. So this, I mean, like these are all the things that I'm considering. I mean, like where I could get an interest in the legal ramifications and what kind of
yeah. I think that nicely comes back to intimacy without proximity, whether it's, you know, like killing someone is intimate, even if you are a drone pilot sitting in a warehouse in Utah, like killing somebody, that's an intimate act. And you also talked about the ways that, you know, like this is an alienating device, but it's also the conditions of possibility for intimacy. And also, you know, not just in Corona time, but for those of us who are nomads, when part of the cosmopolitan elite that caused the pandemic, I sort of see myself as like part of that class. But yeah, these devices are incredibly important in terms of sustaining those intimate relations.
Yeah, they are. I will just read the second question by Federico, which is, I will read it out loud, but if you want to read it on the chat, maybe it's also easier for you. What do you think about the question of extractivism relating to the violence enforced by certain aspects of Western Enlightenment? Considering that where a parallel movement of enlightenment in non-Western communities, Islamic Golden Age or technological development in South America, such as Mayan astronomy and calculus, etc., do you see an act of enforcement extractivism and appropriation that permitted the initial movement of progress in the Western world, which was decaying at the moment, and that was bound by literal violence? And how can this consideration of a parallel enlightenment work to respond to this violence? I don't know who wants to answer first, Julieta or Eben.
Eben.
Thanks. This is not an easy question. I think, you know, rather than a parallel enlightenment, I see critical theory as a chance to kind of respond to this enlightenment project. And there's one book in particular I'd recommend, The Repeating Islands by Antonio Benitez Rojo. It's kind of old at this point, but it's thinking about the assemblages of empire, the assemblages of extractive industries that accompanied European adventures into what was imagined as the New World. So the book is in a Deleuzian idiom, talking about the machines. I think it actually uses the phrase machines. The linking of the flotilla and the warehouse and the donkey train and the gun and, you know, the machine of the plantation and the machinic economy of slavery, and imagines this all as a bricolage, as a sucking iron mouth that took wealth from one part of the world and deposited in another, that allowed, you know, what Emanuel Wallerstein later describes as these, you know, relational dependencies between the first world and the third world, where you know, there's these just growing asymmetries and entanglements. And so I think, you know, it's not just like a parallel enlightenment project, but I think with critical theory, it's not only a project of, you know, recognizing and diagnosing the problems of power flows and capital flows and structural inequalities, but it's being creative with our figuration. It's, you know, like the figure of a vacuum cleaner, right? Like this is the sucking iron mouth that's taking stuff from one part of the world and putting it elsewhere. Like when you have that figure to attach yourself to, there's a concreteness to that figuration that enables you to imagine an otherwise.
I mean, when it comes to extractivism, I wonder if, and you know, I don't have an answer to that, but I wonder if that is a condition to being human, or if that's a condition, like the condition of the establishment of Western capitalism and Western empire. I mean, how could history have been otherwise? Could there be a different set of relationships where, you know, that make a little bit less holes into the Earth's crust? You know, I mean, you know, being Latin American, of course, I romanticize a little bit the indigenous modes of being. And I think, well, I mean, then of course I think about the Aztecs, and they were pretty extractivists themselves. So it's, I mean, it's, you know, and then you think about, you know, people like doing extractivism in the sense of like taking the heart of somebody and eating it, even if it is a ritualistic thing. It's like, well, okay, I don't know if, you know, how much I want to romanticize that. So, I mean, you know, without trying, maybe when I was like thinking about, when we were like talking about enlightenment before, maybe I don't like the word enlightenment so much. So I don't want to think about a parallel enlightenment. Maybe I want to think about modes of being. It's just, I mean, like this light versus dark thing kind of like really throws me off. I don't think it's a very useful thing at, you know, at this point in history, let's say. But I mean, I think there are corrective modes of being. Like, I don't know if it's, I mean, that it is possible I mean, yeah, of course, extractivism is a very violent economical practice. So I don't mean, like, can one have a parallel, like, I mean, I guess a corrective or like a, yeah, no, I don't know. I got very tangled now. No, sorry. Erase the last.
I totally agree with what you're saying, in the sense, like, I don't think an ultra enlightenment is the right idiom. I mean, and yeah, like that genealogy of light in there just has some, like, it seems like at its foundation, a colonizing concept.
I mean, I'm just like trying to think of, you know, to what point are we bound to extractivism as a human condition, and to what point is something to be, you know, is that something that we are like fatally bound to? We extract, we are like the seven dwarfs, or is that something that comes with the Western constellation of the capital, you know, and civilization? And that's,
yeah, I mean, I think all life is bound to extract, right? And I think it's whether you're doing that with industrial assemblages and capitalist assemblages, or what Heather Paxson calls microbiopolitical articulations, like doing biopolitics differently, thinking about the circulation of matter and meaning that kind of subverts.
One thing is circulation. So when you are setting the world in, like, you know, the world is in motion, the things rot, things come up. It's not homeostasis, like things are moving. That I don't consider extractivism per se. That's, I mean, that's life, and that's fine. Right. It's more about like the accumulation. You know, when it comes down to with accumulation.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a condition of like capital, you know, like just looking at the archaeological record back before, you know, the Anthropocene, I hate that word, but, you know, like early Holocene, you know, you see all kinds of hunting and gathering societies, like even if we're just sticking with Central America. So in the highlands of Costa Rica, you saw volcanic eruptions is relatively frequently, like, you know, about every 1,000 years or so. We're about due for one right now. So, like, you know, don't be surprised tomorrow if the highlands of Costa Rica disappear under layers of volcanic ash and lava. And what you saw in those kind of such situations are not like the Aztec or Incan empires that were very much colonial projects, like expanding out and colonizing other indigenous groups. And I think really, you know, what is the idea of indigeneity is relational. It's relational to nationalist projects. It's relational to imperial projects. But in the highlands of Costa Rica, you saw all these folks who are good at getting along in the ruins, who are good at improvising amidst disaster. And that same, you know, deeply embedded knowledge in this place is present today. So people are gardening in the ruins there today. And yeah, so I don't think it's anything essential about the human condition that's you know, connected to a teleology oriented towards modes of development that extract. And, you know, it's a question of relational ethics. It's a question of political systems and hierarchical forms, and even architecture, you know, like so some of these early, and also entanglements with other forms of life. Like Jim Scott has a new, relatively new book that's looking at the sedentary lifestyles that came about as a result of caring for corn and other kinds of crops that demanded folks hang out in the same place from year to year, where the new architectural forms enabled that accumulated excess. You know, the
silos, whatever. Yeah, I imagine.
Yeah, silos, granaries, and you know, those are relatively new. You know, we've only had those for like 15,000 years, which is kind of nothing when you're talking, you know, we've been around on this planet for, you know, 2.5 million years or so. So like those forms of accumulation that do enable power inequities, that do sort of create the conditions of possibility for precarious labor and the sequestration of resources and technology and tools by an elite. Like, yeah, that's new in the human condition. And we can imagine a future otherwise that departs from the current moment. It's not like some kind of nostalgic ideal, like, yeah, give me the, you know, yeah, give me the 60,000 years ago in New Guinea, that wouldn't be much fun in the sense of like living with all kinds of endemic diseases and all kinds of uncertain epistemologies. And, you know, give me the cyborg multi-species microbiopolitical networks of the future, please. Like that's what I can hold on to.
Yeah, I don't if we have about 5 minutes to wrap up, so I don't know if any of you want to add something, a last comment, conclusion, or something that for you is missing.
Maybe just like a thought that I had when you first reached out is the specificity of relation with multiple other species in corona time. So one of the things that I've been studying carefully is the ACE2 receptor and the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, which is the official virologist taxonomic name for COVID-19. And what we know is that many other mammals get this virus. So the same sorts of bubbles that we form with other people, the same sorts of careful intimacies that we negotiate with our pods or, you know, our corona buddies or however you want to figure them, you know, we should be thinking about that with other animals. You know, this virus is present in cats. Like domestic cats are really good at transmitting it to each other. Yeah, the Bronx Zoo had the tiger that was diagnosed. Mink farms have it. Pigs have had it. Dogs have had it. So, you know, not the best time to be engaging with like the feral cat that shows up at your house but also has promiscuous relationships with other households. But maybe it is the time to cultivate new relations with insects and other invertebrates that don't have that same molecular architecture that make them vulnerable. So I think it's an opportunity to, in thinking about intimacy with proximity in the corona time, it's about the specificity of relation to different domains of life. So much bigger categories than species. But yeah, we can have different kinds of intimacies right now that are ethical. But yeah, like most insects probably don't want to hang out. Some might. I mean, I'm getting some beehives to go back to Aladin's project, you know, next week. So, you know, uncomfortable relationships, you know, sometimes you get stung. The person I'm getting bees from just got stung in the face today. And, you know, clearly that intimacy is uncomfortable at times for the insects that are in our care. But how do you imagine other intimacies, like intimacies with ants or butterflies or dragonflies? You know, let's imagine a corona time that enables a post-human future that includes more than just the mammals that are like us.
Yeah, but this is like the Disneyfication of nature, right? I mean, I had to take my son to the zoo today. I was telling you earlier, Aladin. Mm-hmm. Animals that, to me, you know, like their only function is performative. Yeah, like the notion of the animal on the wild does not exist anymore. It's like panda diplomacy, where, you know, like the function of a panda is to be given by the Chinese government to another government on loan so that they perform their job at the zoo. But the idea of a panda, and then we can ponder about the sex life of pandas if we so care about. But the function of a panda in the wild does not exist anymore. So to me, those animals are extinct.
Mm. So yeah, and I guess for me, the intimacy that I'm imagining is not keeping a dragonfly in a cage or a butterfly in a cage, but making tactful, what stingers would call cosmopolitical others to keep them in your world. So whether that's planting milkweeds to summon.
I was getting to that. Yeah. And of course, then if you like plants, for example, you know that the best way to, or you should know that, and if you don't want to use pesticides, one of like the best way to ensure that your plants will be healthy is to encourage ladybugs because they eat the aphids. So you can develop this kind of like productive, intimate relationship with your ladybugs, let's say, for 3 months. I mean, me for 3 months a year, I'm like welcoming the ladybugs, or I don't know, like it's wasp season in Berlin. And so you can develop this kind of like the same set of affects that we have towards mammals. You can develop them towards other sets of the animal and vegetable world, right? Like it's at the end, it's all bound by affect. Why we want maybe are not so attracted to the hyenas. Yeah, like it's all bound to modes of representation. So I mean, like I think that's also part of you know, this idea, like how do we represent this?
Yeah, I think that's a great line to end on. I think we're on the same page. This has been a really fun conversation.
Yeah, it's unfortunately time to end up, but it's perfect timing, I think. Yeah, just before ending the meeting, I would like to thank very much both of you, of course, Julieta and Eben. Julieta, I'm really sorry, I think I mispronounced your name a few times. And also I would like to thank all the New Centre and the New Centre organizer, especially Andrew and Federico for the question, but also all the people involved in the in the making of season 2 of Sheltering Places. And so next week will be the last event of season 2 of Sheltering Places. The event will be moderated by Carl Olsen, with the special guests Amanda Beach and Diane Bauer. The theme will be the impact of new spatial scales for Promethean political projects. So thank you very much all, and all the best. I hope to see you soon.
Okay. Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao.